shan't quit ripping them until I do get buckled.
This phrase formed part of Jack the Ripper's Dear Boss letter to the Central News Agency of London in 1888. He never intended to stop his murderous crusade against the prostitutes of Whitechapel until something stopped him. As he progressed, his murders grew more and more gruesome until they stopped. Almost as quickly and strangely as they had started, they were no more, as if he disappeared into the dead of the night. The police knew that he had slipped through their grasp, and all they could do was pick up the pieces and try to figure out who had committed such atrocities. For those joining this week, the murder spree of Jack the Ripper and the canonical 5 were covered in part 1. So if you haven't already listened to that, I highly recommend you do so. For those who already have, let's get into it. I'm Nick, and this is Chapter 29, Part 2 of the Insidious Agenda podcast titled,
Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
With the police struggling to piece together the unraveling mystery of the identity of Jack the Ripper, we already knew the citizens began to grow cold towards them. They would show up in large crowds to hurl insults and obscenities at the officers conducting their investigations. The public even formed committees to increase public safety, such as that of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, headed by George Lusk. The public was even less interested in getting involved. Outside of personal safety, they weren't incentivized to go out of their way to assist in catching the killer, or provide any information that might tip the police off. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee protested for an award of some kind for information leading to or the capture of Jack the Ripper. Even Charles Warren, the police commissioner who was not popular in the eyes of the media or the public, little known to them, was actually in favor of getting an award. However, it was the Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, who reportedly refused sanctioning a monetary award. It was so easy for people of this time to look down on the efforts of the police department, and by modern standards, the police didn't really have much to go on that would assist with their investigations. During this time, the only true way to catch a killer was to catch them in the act, red-handed, literally. Alternatively, names of suspects could be obtained from word of mouth or from witnesses. If a suspect was brought in for questioning, often getting them to confess outright was the only option. For each of the canonical 5 murders, we know that the discoveries of each of the Ripper's victims happened shortly before the police arrived, varying between minutes to moments. As there were no tracks or evidential blood trails leading away from the crime scenes, there would have been no way to see where Jack disappeared to. As we've previously established, some areas of the borough, like Whitechapel Road, were even busy at the very early hours. If you remember back to the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, it was theorized that it was in this direction that Jack had escaped after that murder. And of course, it was because of the increased police presence throughout Jack's spree that the police were always so close behind. Unfortunately, Jack left them no evidence. Nothing physical, by way of pieces of clothing or murder weapons, nor anything in the midst of the killings that would alert local citizens. He operated in silence. No locals near the crime scenes were alerted to any suspicious individuals or happenings. Sure, they may have heard minor things, like the case of Annie Chapman on Hanbury Street, where the residents recalled hearing something heavy hitting the wood partition between the two houses, or even Israel Schwartz having claimed to have witnessed the murder of Elizabeth Stride in person. But it had to be mildly infuriating to the investigating officers and even some of the witnesses that they may have been mere feet away from Jack the Ripper as he went about his business. Another thing the police had to contend with, and I mentioned this in the introduction, is that the Metropolitan Police Service, sometimes known as Scotland Yard, and H Division Whitechapel had to contend with trying to unmask the Ripper. Two different police services that, although had seconded or lent some of their investigators back and forth, conducted separate investigations into the Ripper. The Whitechapel Police Service were on their own, completely, until the murder of Catherine Eddowes, which bled into the jurisdiction of the MPS. As the Whitechapel Service was only responsible for their 1.44 kilometers of the impoverished borough, it was Eddowes' body that drew in the Metropolitan Police, whose jurisdiction was for the City of London proper. Although the two forces did cooperate and are believed to have worked well together, the MPS investigated independently of the Whitechapel murder file. Though it seemed like a division in force capability, the police are rarely ever held at fault for the Jack the Ripper murders. And no, not because the governments want to shelter their police service, but because catching a serial killer is a near insurmountable task, especially when you consider that the police in the 19th century didn't have the technology that we have in the 21st. Probably the biggest advantage that modern policing has that those over the time of the Ripper did not was the ability to identify and collect forensic evidence. Though convictions due to physical evidence had only been around for about 100 years at this point, the advent of the forensics, or DNA-based evidence, wouldn't be used in trial for almost 100 years after the Ripper murders in 1983. Aside from the aforementioned catching someone red-handed, autopsies and witness statements taken during inquisitions were often the only things police had to go on. Though believed to have existed in the Far East as far back as 300 BC, the use of fingerprinting wasn't used in England until 1901. Needless to say, Jack the Ripper was a master of leaving a crime scene clean. And I definitely use the word clean in quotation marks. No evidence, other than the victims, of course, that he was there. Nothing to identify who he was, and no tracks or trails leading away from the crime scene. With the odds stacked against them, the police were unable to accomplish the impossible. They weren't able to identify Jack the Ripper, whether it be because of a lack of evidence, coordination in investigating with other police services, or mishandling evidence. Jack the Ripper slipped through their fingers. But the murders done by Jack the Ripper were not without their suspects. The list is incredibly far-reaching and does not discriminate against religious belief or nationality. Though it's an extensive list, for the purposes of this episode, I'll cover some, just so we don't bleed into a part 3. I'll give you an idea of some that are a bit far-fetched, and finally ending with 3 that could entirely be tangible. And those 3 are the police's favorite suspect, science's, and then finally mine. Through the 11 murders that comprise the Whitechapel murder file, the police services claim to have interviewed over 2,000 people, of which they investigated 300 further and led to a total of 80 detainments. Let's first start by profiling Jack the Ripper from the perspective of police with what we know so far. All of the victims of Jack's murder spree were prostitutes. Each murder grew progressively more gruesome, with his final 3 having organs removed, and his final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, being emptied out almost entirely. The first of the Whitechapel murders, Emma Elizabeth Smith, happened on the 3rd of April in 1888, while the last, Frances Coles, was recorded as the 13th of February in 1891, coincidentally, a Friday. The canonical five, Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, and Kelly, the attributed murders of the Ripper, took place between the 31st of August and the 9th of November. No witnesses to the murders came forward, or were able to offer a clear description of Jack. Only often, the shabby genteel men that accompanied the future victims the night of the murders were ever stated. The descriptions of Jack that have been given have him standing between 5'5" and 5'7", often wearing a hat, bowler, felt, or peaked, an overcoat, and being a stout, dark-haired man of foreign appearance, with a mustache. He operated, killing swiftly, and was able to maintain control of his victims during these attacks, save, self-admittedly, Elizabeth Stride, whom Jack himself had stated squealed in the Saucy Jackie postcard. There was no evidence of torture or sexual assault on any of the victims. They all sustained further injury, and in some cases mutilation, after death. As trophies, Jack the Ripper would often take rings from his victims. All of his victims were known to be frequently drunk, high-risk victims, and were killed in the early hours of the morning. They were all killed outdoors, save for Mary Jane Kelly, as she was most mutilated of all. It may have been his intent to conduct a pseudo-autopsy on her, needing a location that would both offer him time and secrecy. Jack the Ripper maintained his modus operandi, or his common calling cards, with each murder appearing almost ritualistic. He dresses in clothes that are not out of the ordinary in Whitechapel society. The United States' FBI file from 1988 even profiles Jack's likely childhood upbringing. Their description, a now unclassified document from the FBI vault, is truly intriguing. Especially chilling is the final part of it. I'll give you their profile of Jack the Ripper now. He comes from a family where he was raised by a domineering mother and a weak, passive, or absent father. In all likelihood, his mother drank heavily and enjoyed the company of many men. As a result, he failed to receive consistent care and contact with stable adult role models. Consequently, he became detached socially and developed a diminished emotional response towards his fellow man. He became asocial, preferring to be alone. His anger became internalized, and in his young years, he expressed his pent-up destructive emotions by setting fires and torturing small animals. By perpetrating these acts, he discovered increased areas of dominance, power, and control, and learned how to continue violent, destructive acts without detection or punishment. As he grew older, his fantasy developed a strong component that included domination, cruelty, and mutilation of women. We would expect to find evidence of this violent, destructive fantasy life throughout personal writings, as well as drawings of women being mutilated. For employment, he would seek a position where he could work alone and vicariously experience his destructive fantasies. Such employment would include work as a butcher, mortician's helper, medical examiner's assistant, or hospital attendant. He is employed Monday through Friday, and on Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday he is off from work. He has carried a knife for defense purposes, just in case he was ever attacked. He would be ready. This paranoid type of thinking is, in part, justified because of the poor self-image he has of himself. He would be expected to have some type of physical abnormality. However, although not severe, he perceives this as being psychologically crippling. We would look for someone below or above average in height and or weight. He may have problems with speech, scarred complexion, physical illness, or injury. We would not expect this type of offender to be married. If he was married in the past, it would have been someone older than himself, and the marriage would have been for a short duration. He is not adept in meeting people socially, and the major extent of his heterosexual relationships would be with prostitutes. Due to the lack of hygiene practices by prostitutes at that time, and the absence of treatment for venereal disease, he may have been infected. If infected, this would further fuel his hatred and disgust for women. He would be perceived as being quiet, a loner, shy, slightly withdrawn, obedient, and neat and orderly in appearance and when working. He drinks in the local pubs, and after a few spirits, he becomes more relaxed and finds it easier to engage in conversation. He lives or works in the Whitechapel area. The first homicide should be in close proximity to either his home or workplace. It is noted that London Hospital is only 1 block from the first homicide, and as stated earlier in this analysis, we would expect other violent crimes in this vicinity. Investigators would have interviewed him during the course of the investigation, and he was probably talked to by police on several occasions. Unfortunately, at this time, there was no way to correlate this type of information. Therefore, he was overlooked. Investigators and citizens in the community had a preconceived idea or picture of what Jack the Ripper would look like. Because of the belief he would appear odd or ghoulish in appearance, he was overlooked or eliminated as a potential suspect. If the idea that investigators and police would have questioned him during an inquisition or the police would have talked to him on the street doesn't make your blood run cold, I don't know what will. The first suspect we'll examine is one we already know, Leather Apron himself, the bootmaker, a Polish Jew, John Pizer. Pizer was already on the police's radar for a prior stabbing offense and was believed by Police Sergeant William Thick to have been the perpetrator of a series of minor assaults against different prostitutes in Whitechapel. Because of these occurrences and the media pointing the finger at him, Pizer was arrested by Thick, even though the lead investigator of Nichols and Chapman's murders stated that there was no evidence whatsoever against him. Of course, Pizer had alibis for the 2 murders and was cleared of any wrongdoing. He was staying with relatives at the time of Nichols's murder and was in the presence of a police officer on the docks watching a fire during Chapman's. Pizer was compensated for the slander of his name by that newspaper. Thick, meanwhile, was even accused of being the Ripper himself in a letter sent to the Home Office in 1889, but it was discovered that the letter was malicious and unfounded. Another suspect was even drawn from the royal family, that of Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria and an heir to the throne. Though he died young, at the age of 28 in 1892, after contracting syphilis, Victor wasn't named as a suspect until 1962. The proposed theory that took hold in 1970 believed that Victor was driven mad after contracting syphilis. He did have strong alibis for the murders of all women, and not many believed he was actually mad. The suspicion surrounding Victor was more by way of suggestion rather than outright finger-pointing. I won't get into much else surrounding Albert Victor, as the theory really goes off the deep end in terms of tying many different people together, and often comes off mostly as a hoax rather than a tangible suspect. The first of our truly possible suspects is actually the discoverer of Mary Ann Nichols, the Ripper's first victim, Charles Cross. When Cross discovered Nichols's body, he claimed to have stumbled upon her on his way to work. when he called to Robert Paul for assistance, there was no blood around her. Only minutes later, when police constables were summoned, had blood started to pool. He had previously refused Paul's suggestion to prop Nichols up so she wasn't on the ground, as that would have given away the fact that her throat was cut. Neither man reported seeing anyone else in the area that morning, which also had no side exits. The belief in this suspect is that Cross had begun the mutilation process of Nichols's body when he heard Paul coming and feigned his story as the discoverer. He didn't even come forward for the inquisition until Robert Paul named him to the press. During the inquisition, it was even discovered that his name was not actually Charles Cross, but rather Charles Allen Leshmere, with Cross being the surname of his stepfather. On later examination, Leshmere's home address, location, and family members, even his route to and from work, match up with the times and locations of each of the Ripper murders. This route was extremely or identically close to the locations of the murders of Martha Tabram, Nichols, and Chapman. His times dismissed from work match up with the believed times of the murders. His only night off work was Saturday night, coincidentally, the night of the double murder of Stride and Eddowes. Stride's murder was near Leshmere's mother's house, where he grew up. The route he took to work from his mother's house was that on which Eddowes' murder took place, a route he had taken religiously for 20 years. Mary Jane Kelly's accommodation was also on his route to work. He even matches the same background of many serial killers, such as being from a broken home, not having known his father, the passage of various other men through his childhood. His occupation of being a meat cart driver would have also explained or hid blood spatter on his clothing from Nichols's murder. Needless to say, Charles Leshmere is certainly a believable suspect. As mentioned previously, our last three suspects in this episode will discuss the police's top suspect, Science's, and then lastly my own. The police's chief suspect for Jack the Ripper was a 31-year-old teacher and barrister named Montague John Druitt. Coming up from a wealthy family, Druitt was very educated and well off, and was a big supporter of the sport of cricket. He had lost his father in 1885, and was only left a small portion of his family's holdings, along with his brothers. On the 30th of November, he was fired from his job at the Blackheath Boys' School, although it's unknown as to why he was let go. In the later words of his brother William, Montague had gotten into serious trouble, but he declined to speak on it further. Shortly thereafter, he disappeared, with some, like his cricket club, believing he had gone abroad. On New Year's Eve in 1888, his body was discovered afloat in the Thames River. His pockets were filled with stones, which the police believed had kept his body submerged for over a month. He was believed to have been driven to suicide for being a homosexual and may have had some kind of psychiatric illness. Other than being let go from the school shortly after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, how does Druitt tie in as potentially being Jack the Ripper? In February of 1891, Henry Farquharson, a member of Parliament for West Dorset, stated that Jack the Ripper was the son of a surgeon. Although he did not name Druitt outright, the description he gave matched him to a T. Later, journalist George Sims stated that the Ripper's body was found in the Thames, of course, having been there for a month, believing he had committed suicide the night of the last murder in 1888. Assistant Commissioner Melville McNaughton named Druitt directly in his 1894 memorandum, claiming to have had private information that left little doubt that Druitt's own family believed he was the murderer. Many claims have been made, including that of Druitt's cousin, who published a pamphlet in Australia in 1961, stating that he was related to Jack the Ripper. Though not a concrete suspect, there is a high amount of suspicion about the disappearance and suicide of Montague Druitt, but with it, a varying degree of counterpoints as well, something you can dig well into. Our second last suspect in the episode is the one that modern science believes is in fact Jack the Ripper. In McNaughton's 1894 memorandum, he named another Polish Jew who was then admitted to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum as the chief suspect in the Jack the Ripper murders. The name Kosminski, with no first name, was also confirmed by Chief Inspector Donald Swanson in the memoirs of Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson. In the memoir, Anderson wrote the following. Later, in the investigations, the police concluded that Jack the Ripper and his people were low-class Polish Jews. But, since the person who identified him was also a Polish Jew, and the people of that class in the East End will not give up one of their number to gentle justice, the suspect was never prosecuted. Anderson was extremely convinced of the culpability of this suspect. Many years later, in 1987, Martin Fido, an author and true crime writer, began searching asylum records for any inmates with the surname Kosminski. There was only one person found, Aaron Kosminski. He was found to have lived in Whitechapel during the murders. In the asylum, he was mainly harmless, and his insanity took the form of auditory hallucinations, and he refused to be fed by other people, also refusing to wash and bathe. Kosminski is refuted as a suspect by FBI profiler John Douglas, as, paranoid as he was, Kosminski would have likely boasted about his murders and being the killer, although no record exists that he ever did either. In 2014, a DNA analysis was conducted on the shawl of Catherine Eddowes. The genetic match determined that the link was based on mitochondrial DNA, which can be shared amongst thousands of people. This type can only be used to exclude a suspect, not to implicate them. There is also no substantial evidence that the shawl, recovered by Constable Amos Simpson, was even taken from Eddowes in the first place, or that it actually belonged to her. It's highly controversial, and though some science does point to Aaron Kosminski as the culprit, it's not enough to convict him outright. And finally, the last suspect is the one I believe most likely to have been Jack the Ripper, and his name was James Kelly. No, he wasn't related to Mary Jane Kelly. Kelly wasn't suggested until authors Terence Sharkey and Jim Tully named him in their books around 1997. Kelly was abandoned by his mother shortly after birth and raised by his grandmother. When he turned 18, he took up work as an upholsterer. Around the time, meeting 18-year-old Sarah Brider only 2 years later. Sarah was described as demure and young, but was a hard-working Catholic girl. Sarah's parents were taken with Kelly, who they believed was a good-mannered, religious man. The two moved into her parents' house together shortly thereafter. As if seemingly out of the blue, Kelly developed an explosive temper and became increasingly unpredictable. This would lead to him being let go from his place of employment. Only days afterward, he married Sarah in a small religious ceremony at San Lucas Parish on the 4th of June in 1883. James turned on his wife. His obsessiveness was crushing, and he would often scold her for infidelity, for which he had no evidence, even going so far as to believe she had a sexually transmitted infection. Only 17 days after their wedding, on the 21st of June, 1883, James Kelly took up a knife and stabbed his wife in the throat in the midst of an argument. He was arrested the following day by police for aggravated homicide. The coroner found him to be mentally fit, thus he would stand trial. Though Sarah Brider initially survived the attack, she did succumb to her grave injuries 3 days later. Kelly was sentenced to death by hanging, set for the 20th of August in 1883, but 2 weeks before that, when he was examined by the superintendent of Broadmoor Hospital, Dr. Orange, he was declared insane. His sentence of death was commuted, and he would instead be confined to Broadmoor Asylum indefinitely. At Broadmoor, he was described as a model inmate. Most curious is that on the 23rd of January in 1888, Kelly was able to fashion himself a key out of a piece of metal and escape the asylum. He was branded a fugitive, and an arrest warrant was granted and distributed. It wasn't until the 10th of November that year, after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, that police raided his former home, where he and his wife lived with Sarah's parents, but found no traces of him whatsoever. James Kelly wasn't heard from again until 1927, 39 years after his escape. He had arrived to the gates of Broadmoor Asylum on the 12th of February, begging to be readmitted. He even went so far as to tell a local newspaper, "I am very tired, and I want to die with my friends." He was readmitted and passed away 2 years later of double lobular pneumonia. Kelly, during his time on the outside, had escaped to the United States and may have been responsible for several murders around the country. This is believed, as many prostitutes there had been murdered in almost identical fashion to the Ripper murders in London. One murder that stands out from the time in the United States is the murder of Carrie Brown, a prostitute who was found mutilated, with her throat cut in a New York hotel on the 24th of April in 1891. Sound familiar? NYPD Detective Ed Norris was granted special permission to view Kelly's file from Broadmoor, the first time it was opened since 1927. He believed that James Kelly fit the perfect profile for Jack the Ripper. Kelly had professed a hatred for prostitutes, and in a diary of his, he stated that he had been in London during the period the canonical 5 murders took place. Curiously enough, of his time in the United States, Kelly stated he was committed to fighting against evil. Everything about the suspicion around Kelly seems to fit perfectly. From here, as we progress into what might have happened to Jack the Ripper, I'll leave it to you to decide who he might have been. Again, the suspects named in this episode are only a few, with some unlikely suspects and some highly likely suspects named to give you an idea of how far it truly ranges. There are many more threads you can unravel, and it's highly suggested to continue investigating if you have a genuine interest in the subject material. Yes, there are some likely suspects and details I've omitted, like Walter Sickert, Francis Tumblety, and even Mary Jane Kelly's own boyfriend, Joseph Barnett, who might have had the strongest motive. But in the interests of time, we'll leave it with these. No arrests or convictions have ever been made in the Jack the Ripper murders, so we're left to wonder, what might have happened to Jack? Let's explore this further. The last victim of the Whitechapel murder file is that of Frances Coles, who died from having her throat cut. So, if it's remotely believed that Jack was active that long, he had survived until at least 1891. The most plausible, and of course eventual explanation, was that he continued living and eventually passed away in London. The average life expectancy at this time was around 45 years of age. With the FBI's profile, and I'll link this in the show notes, placing Jack somewhere between the ages of 28 and 36, it was likely he would have passed away sometime just after the turn of the century. As he's never been found, the circumstances are largely guesswork. Is it possible he committed suicide? If we look at Montague Druitt as being Jack the Ripper, this seems like the explanation. If McNaughton and his private information are to be believed, that's the one. Could he have been committed to an insane asylum, like Kosminski or Kelly? Did he leave the country and head off into his blood-red sunset? Or did he simply just stop killing, being finished with whatever twisted, ritualistic task he charged himself with? Or could it possibly have been a myriad of other factors that drove him away, such as increased police presence due to the murderous rampage? The only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything. We're no closer to figuring out the mystery of Jack the Ripper now than the police were in 1888. Through modernization of science and forensic evidence, we may someday be able to unmask the monster. Even though it has been over a century since the Whitechapel murders, events from the past still echo into modern day. For Jack the Ripper and his victims may still walk among the people of Whitechapel, albeit on the other side of the veil. On Bucks Row, the voice of Mary Ann Nichols can still be heard crying out in the midst of her murder. Even over the rail construction taking place in the vicinity, workers have claimed to hear this as clear as day. Her apparition has been sighted in the gutter where she was found, sometimes reported to glow green or gray. The first reporting of Polly Nichols's apparitions were reported as early as 1895. The area is also said to affect many animals that pass through, so much that they avoid the area altogether. The house on Hanbury Street, where Annie Chapman was murdered, was demolished in the 1970s, and the Truman Brewery now sits on the former site. As early as the 1930s, staff have claimed to hear Annie being murdered in the area where the backyard used to be. Other ghostly sounds have been noticed by those visiting the site. A woman gasping for breath, a man breathing heavily, and the sounds of a knife cutting through the air. Annie Chapman's apparition has been seen walking down Hanbury Street, accompanied by a shadow man. They always stop at number 29. One of the old tenants across the road from 29 Hanbury, before the demolition, claimed to have saw on multiple occasions a man and woman enter the house, albeit the door would never open for them, and they would pass through cleanly. Today, in the Truman Brewery, the site of the former backyard rests underneath the storeroom, where staff have reported seeing a headless apparition. On the 8th of September each year, that area of the brewery is said to get unusually cold. Annie Chapman is also believed to haunt the 10 Bells pub, which still stands in Whitechapel today. Strange winds inside and even some poltergeist behavior have been reported. Although the landlady is unsure whom it is, she believes it just might be Annie. There's not much reported activity where Elizabeth Stride was murdered, which is now a gate to the Dutfields Yard on Henrique Street. Shortly after the murder, residents claim to have heard Elizabeth Stride crying out, and then silenced. This would be the majority of the phenomena exhibited at that location, possibly, as an opinion of mine, as Jack the Ripper didn't have time to finish with her. Elizabeth Stride likely found peace in the afterlife. If you're wandering through Mitre Square in late September, you just might catch a glimpse of the ripped-up body of Catherine Eddowes. Her body is said to present itself to some passers-by around and especially on the anniversary of her death. On some nights, it's even said the old cobblestones glow red where she was murdered. Mary Jane Kelly's old accommodation at 13 Miller's Court was demolished and now the site of the Whites Row car park, as well as the fruit and wool exchange buildings. Shortly after her murder, her room in the lodging house was rented out, with blood stains still on the walls. In 1959, a woman came forward stating she had knowledge that Kelly's mother had moved into 13 Miller's Court after the murder, and witnesses have claimed that a bloody handprint was still on the wall, that when cleaned off, would continue to appear. In the years that followed her murder, Mary Jane Kelly was said to roam the premises, clad entirely in black, gazing at the current occupants through their windows. This happened as frequently as the night she died. The legacy of Jack the Ripper and the canonical five will live forever. We may never know the true identity of Jack and may be left chasing ghosts for the rest of time. We do know that there were many suspects, most with plausible motives. We know that the police, lacking the modern advances of technology, were unable to bring the criminal Jack the Ripper to justice, although it's still chilling to think that on more than one occasion, they may have been face to face with him and never knew it. Above all, if the reports are to be true, the apparitions of the canonical five still roam Whitechapel to this day, ever in search of rest. The Whitechapel murder file is horrific, and although the investigations did not meet success, we can speak the names of his victims for the rest of time, for history will never forget them. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. And unseen, in blood, at the bottom of that file, is surely written,
Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
If you're hearing this message, you survived our stroll through Whitechapel and the murderous spree of Jack the Ripper. I truly hope you enjoyed both this week's episode as well as part 1, which aired last week, our 2-part Jack the Ripper series. Above all, I hope that you learned something, and thank you very much for choosing to listen to my podcast. Before you go, remember to leave us a review and ensure you subscribe so you can find your way back next week for an episode about the former prison and now island of horrors known as Alcatraz. New episodes release every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious agenda. I'll see you again next week, and thank you for listening.